Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach, and on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, why self-compassion is essential for every parent's mental health. I am speaking with a returning guest, Dr. Kristin Neff. She's an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, conducting the first empirical studies on self-compassion more than 20 years ago. She's been recognized as one of the most influential researchers in psychology worldwide. Kristin runs the Self-Compassion Community, an online learning platform where people can learn the skill of self-compassion with the help of others. She is author of the best-selling books, Self-Compassion and Fierce Self-Compassion. Two excellent books, and I highly recommend them. Along with her colleague, Chris Gerner, she developed the empirically supported Mindful Self-Compassion program and co-founded the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. Together, they co-wrote the best-selling The Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook and their latest book, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout. I will have links in the show notes to their bios, to their websites, to their social media, and to their resources. If you ever feel like you're failing as a parent or that you are somehow damaging your children, if you're overwhelmed by self-doubt and shame, if there are moments when you don't even like your children and you just wish you could disappear, if your inner critic is relentless, always harsh when you make a mistake, what you really need is today's conversation. You need self-compassion. And if that idea feels too soft or even unnecessary, and your first reaction is, I don't need that, then you probably need it more than you think. You have to learn to be on your own side. You need to treat yourself with the kindness and care you deserve, just as you would a close friend. If you're compassionate towards others but not toward yourself, then your practice of compassion is incomplete. It's easy to dismiss self-compassion as a nice idea that doesn't apply to you, but it does. And no, it's not about self-pity, nor is it a way to let yourself off the hook. It's about giving yourself the grace to be human, especially when things feel hard. And how does self-compassion help? It helps because it gives you the strength to keep going, even when you feel like you can't anymore. It helps you show up for yourself and in turn, show up better for your children. It may sound almost too simple to be true, but trust me, it works. Over time, you can cultivate self-compassion, and it will help you navigate the challenges of parenting and life so much more effectively. It's really a superpower. I hope you find this episode helpful. Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. I think since the last time I spoke with you, you've written 2 books, but in that time, I have become more self-compassionate as a result of your teachings and your work. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah. And I think I even made a big realization, which I would share with you since I work with parents. I think the most important tool that any parent can cultivate is self-compassion.
Yeah, I would agree with that as a parent myself. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember the stories that you shared with me. I think it was back in 2018. And of course, personal stories are always wonderful, but I think it would be good. I know this is probably not the best annoying way to start it, but to define self-compassion for those people who haven't listened to the first one and who are new even to the podcast or to this concept. Briefly, what is self-compassion and what are the benefits of it?
Yeah. So if you just break down the word compassion, and the Latin passion means to suffer, calm is with. So basically, how do we show up in times of difficulty or struggle, emotional struggle? And normally we think of that as how do we show up for others? So a self compassion is how do we show up for ourselves if we're struggling? Again, whether that's because we're feeling badly about ourselves or we made some mistake or we're just going through a really difficult time in life. Do we show up with it for ourselves in a supportive, kind, warm way? Or do we call ourselves names? Do we like harshly criticize ourselves? And the research is very, very clear. There's, I think, over 7,000 studies at this point showing that when you show up for yourself in an encouraging, supportive, helpful way, it's actually not surprising if you think about it. You do better. You're stronger. You're more resilient. You're more able to get through stressful times. You're less likely to burn out. You have better physical health. You're happier. You're more satisfied with your life. You're less depressed. I mean, the list really goes on and on. And it makes sense also because if you don't show up for yourself in a helpful way when you're struggling, if you shame yourself or ignore yourself, then that means then we're at risk for falling into negative states of mind like depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress syndrome or becoming burnt out or developing an eating disorder, whatever it is, the things that happen when we can't cope with the pain of life or the pain of being an imperfect human being. And when we make it worse for ourselves by being cruel and cold and isolating ourselves, then, we're just kicking ourselves when we're down.
And it's very interesting, since we're talking about parenting specifically on this podcast, it's two things. We learn self-criticism from our parents if we had self-critical parents or perfectionistic, anxious parents. We learn, they didn't model self-compassion for us. And number two, they weren't there for us when we needed them to be our coach and emotional support. So those are two big things I think for many of us are, get in the way of even accepting that self-compassion is a good thing because we haven't internalized that. Can you speak about this a little bit?
Yeah, so self-compassion doesn't come very necessarily naturally for most people. There's actually, so one reason is we mentioned most of our parents didn't model it for us. Our culture doesn't tell us it's a good thing. We're raised that it's a good thing to be compassionate to others and self-sacrificing. But no one says, hey, have you checked in with yourself, what you need, trying to, see if you can help yourself in some way. And just to make matters worse, evolutionarily, it's not totally natural. So the care system, the tend and befriend system, primarily evolved to care for others, for our family members or our in-group members. It's actually a little more natural when we're hurting to go into the threat defense mode because we interpret that pain as a signal of there's a threat, there's a danger, fight, flight, or freeze. We turn that inward because the danger is coming from inside of us. So we criticize ourselves harshly, thinking somehow that fighting ourselves will help us be safe, or we flee into a sense of shame and isolation, kind of, metaphorically hanging our head, keeping ourselves safe from the angry group members we think may judge us, or we freeze and we get stuck, thinking that maybe if we just don't do anything, the problem will go away. That's natural for when we're hurting. It's actually more natural when your friend is hurting or your child is hurting to go into the care system. So this, don't beat yourself up if you beat yourself up. There's very good reasons why. The good news about this, though, is that because caring is natural for others, again, for our children, for our family members, for people who are close to us, we already know how to do it. We don't actually have to learn a new skill. We just have to remember and give ourselves permission to be kind and supportive to ourselves. And then once you do that, not only is it a gift to yourself, not only will it make you a better parent, it's the biggest gift you can possibly give your children if they grow up knowing that this is a more healthy way to relate to yourself.
Yeah, isn't that true? Could you give an example perhaps to illustrate that point specifically? Because some people probably will say, oh, it's so selfish, it's so indulgent to practice self-compassion. I feel like I said this the other day to someone and then posted in my Facebook group. People are like, I'm a people pleaser, I'm a people pleaser, I'm a people pleaser. But what we do in reality when we please others is we abandon ourselves. So why are we calling it people pleasing? When you say I'm self-abandoning, self-neglecting, it's like, ooh, do you want to do that? No, I don't. So it kind of awakens you to the idea of self-compassion. I think it's simple to practice self-compassion, but the hurdle is that resistance to it. What could we do to overcome that?
Yeah, well, that's kind of, my calling in life is to try to not only do research, but to explain to people. And really, it is common sense why that's not the case. So for one, if you constantly give to others, you give to others and not yourself, you will burn out. When you're burnt out, you're no use to anyone. When you have no energy, when you're exhausted, when you feel cut off and you feel numb. So I actually just came out with the book, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout, for this very reason. It is not selfish. In order to maintain the energy and resources needed to care for others, we have to turn the light of compassion inward as well as outward. So that's one reason, because we will burn out. Another one is, what are we modeling for other people? For instance, we taught self-compassion to nurses and doctors at a children's hospital, where the culture was all about, sacrificing for the kids, working, 3 straight shifts in a row, putting the kids first. And actually, of course, burnout was a huge problem there. So everyone was kind of buying into this idea that denying yourself somehow meant you cared more about others. It's not the case. Again, first of all, when you're burnt out, you can't take care of others. You're giving the message that your needs aren't important. When I say my needs aren't important and yours are, then the other person thinks, oh, that must mean my needs aren't important and other people's are. I mean, it kind of spreads the message. And again, it doesn't work. And here's another reason why it doesn't work. We impact each other. Our state of mind impacts other people. So if I'm burnt out and I'm full of shame, other people are resonating with someone who's burnt out and full of shame, as opposed to someone who's resonating with someone who's satisfied, fulfilled in their life, happy, calm, peaceful. The presence we bring into the world impacts others, independently of what we actually do for them. So being, down on ourselves is actually, we're bringing that darkness to everyone we meet. And not to have one more thing you criticize for yourself about, but think about it. What energy are you bringing out into the world? When you give yourself compassion and understanding and kindness and warmth and care and balance, you are just this little light of compassion that shines to everyone you meet.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's like when we give to others but never to ourselves, then that's not real love. What is that saying? And I don't remember who said that. If your self-compassion doesn't include yourself, it's incomplete.
Yeah, it is incomplete. But I mean, it's not the case that you have to be self-compassionate before you're compassionate to others, because actually that's the way most people are. People are honestly compassionate to others and not to themselves. So it can happen, but first of all, it's not sustainable. And also what it does is it sets a separation between you and others. Like, oh, their needs are important and mine aren't. Therefore, I am separate from others. This not engendering a sense of interconnectedness or shared humanity or the realization that all people's needs are important, including mine. And so it just exacerbates that sense of separation, which is the source of so much suffering in our lives.
That's a good point. Why kindness is not enough, and that we need to practice self-compassion, because it has 3 elements, right? Why kindness is not enough?
So there are 3 elements of self-compassion. One is warmth and kindness, which is kind of the most obvious one. But there are 2 other elements that make it a healthy and stable mindset. One is mindfulness. So in order to show up for ourselves when we're suffering, we need to be mindful of our suffering. In other words, we can't just ignore it, suppress it. We can't pretend it's not there. On the other hand, mindfulness is a balanced way of being with things as they are. If we're lost in our suffering, we're so absorbed by the drama of what's happening that we have no perspective anymore. We're just kind of like carried away by our difficult emotions. Then we can't help ourselves either. So the mindfulness is kind of the necessary first step to be aware that we're struggling, but in kind of balanced way with some space around it so we can take action. Then there's the kindness, but also really importantly, and this is what differentiates self-compassion from maybe like self-love or self-care, those don't necessarily include other people. Compassion, by definition, is rooted in our humanity. What's the difference between compassion and pity? If I pity someone, I'm looking down on them. I feel separate from them. Compassion is, hey, I've been there. The same thing with self-compassion. So self-pity is, woe is me, poor me. It's a very self-focused state. Self-compassion is, hey, I'm an imperfect human being, like all imperfect human beings. We're kind of all in this together. So it's by its very nature a connected stance. And we need that sense of interconnection. Well, first of all, to strengthen us. For human beings, we're social creatures. The most the most scary feeling in the world is one of isolation, separation, feeling like we don't belong. So remembering that, we are a card carrying member of the human race, which does not mean being perfect, which does not mean having all our what together. It means making mistakes, failing, stumbling, doing the best we can, getting up and trying again. That's what it means to be human. So when we frame our mistakes or our challenges in light of this shared human experience, we feel more connected to other people. And that's partly what strengthens us. That's where some of the strength of self-compassion comes from. It's not me, it's me too.
So is there room for self-pity at all before self-compassion?
Well, sure, self-pity will arise, right? So it's natural. We kind of feel sorry for ourselves, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's limiting. So if I'm just feeling sorry for myself, first of all, our perspective is often kind of skewed. We think, I've got the worst thing in the world because I've got this problem. And we don't forget that actually in the bigger picture, maybe it's not the end of the world. Now, we don't want to use this to belittle our suffering either. We don't want to use this to say, oh, who am I to complain because there are children in war zones right now? All suffering is worthy of a compassionate response, including our own. And the thing is, our own suffering is the one where we've got most proximity to. We've got the most chance of doing something effectively about, what's happening for us. And so, maybe your goal is to help children in war zones. That's a wonderful goal. But if you don't take you don't take care of your stress or your pain at home, you aren't going to have the resources to be able to do that good work in the world. Your mind is the one you're having contact with 24/7. You need to really clean up your own house. Is there warmth? Is there kindness? Is there feeling of connectedness? Am I being mindful in my own heart and mind? That's what we need to work on first. And if we do that, then it really makes us in a much better place to help others, puts us in a much better place. Whether it's children in war zones or your own kids who are in the war zone of their playroom, kids tantruming or fighting or whatever, think about that mindset you need to cultivate as a parent to try to model for your kids. What does it look like to deal with difficulty in a constructive way? What does it look like to handle emotional ups and downs with some equanimity? So self-compassion is the thing that's going to help you cultivate the mindset that you hope and you pray your children eventually develop.
How about your own son? Has he internalized the self-compassion? What can you say?
Yes, he has. So I talk a lot about my son in my books because, he is autistic and there were some definite challenges with that. So when he was younger, he was very hard to reach. So when he tantrumed, all kids tantrum, but it was incredibly hard to reach him just because of his physiology and we get lost in these loops. And so I actually found that I could regulate him by regulating myself. I couldn't reach him directly, for instance, if he was super upset and maybe lost in a doozy of a tantrum. But I could calm myself. I could put my own hands on my heart. I could visibly calm down in his presence. And his mirror neurons, would still interact with mine and still feel my calmer. When I got upset and frustrated, he would ramp up. But if I could calm down and soothe and care for myself, he would start to calm down. And then that would actually, enable me to reach him directly. So I always talk to him about self-compassion. Now, if I'm upset, I'll say, don't be too hard on yourself, Mom. It happens to everyone. He does it. He's got a little mantra he says to himself if he gets kind of caught in a loop or negative thought pattern. He'll say, tricky brain, I know you're trying to keep me safe, but it's really not helping right now. But he says it in a very warm, compassionate tone, which helps him remember, because the autism is his brain just, works differently. It does. He also has some other brain differences. So he definitely practices self-compassion. He puts his hand on his heart. And by the way, whether it's me or him, it doesn't mean that self-criticism or feelings of shame will never arise again. They will, because they're part of our evolutionary, equipment. They are passed down through evolution. There's certain, advantages evolutionarily if we feel shame or we kind of, we don't piss off other group members. So that helps us be a better group member. So the feelings still arise. Self-criticism is just kind of a natural safety behavior, but you don't necessarily have to feed it or even believe it. It arises, it hurts, and you give yourself compassion for feeling shame and self-criticism. Because again, you didn't even really choose to. It just arose. Okay, I'm really hurting. How can I be kind to myself? This is human. Everyone does this. It's our evolutionary heritage as human beings. I'm not alone. How can I be warm and kind and supportive to myself?
That doesn't mean that we're minimizing our problems or suffering, right?
Oh, no, quite the opposite. It means research is very clear. For instance, some people think that it means letting yourself off the hook, not taking responsibility or not taking things seriously. It's exactly the opposite. Because when you have the skills and the resources to be there, to be with your pain or the problem, whatever it is, then that actually, first of all, allows you to take responsibility because it's emotionally safe to say, wow, I really screwed up. How can I repair the situation? You actually can admit it, because just because I made a mistake doesn't mean that I am a mistake. And therefore, it's easier for me to admit it and then try to repair the situation. Otherwise, we avoid it because it's just too painful. And so it allows us to be with more calm and equanimity and grit, for instance. I talked to Angela Duckworth, who developed the whole grit literature, and she says she thinks self-compassion is the number one thing that allows people to have grit or stick-to-itness. Even when things get tough, if we can be with that toughness, that difficulty, that fear, again, with presence, with a sense of connectedness, with some warmth and encouragement, we're just more likely to be able to, again, acknowledge what's happening and then try to do something about it.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you are suffering and someone is there as a supportive, warm, caring, guiding person, you're going to succeed. The motivation is not going to go down, and of course, we know fear works, fear tactics in parenting and otherwise. But like, do you want to choose the fear, or you want to use this other loving, kind path, right? That encourages intrinsic motivation. Of course, it makes sense. Like that motivation rises from it. The grit rises, the resilience. It just,
It does. So the fear works, but not as well, because it creates this backlash of like performance anxiety, for instance. So fear may get your attention and motivate you, but if you're distracted by all the negative thoughts or feelings of fear, or your cortisol levels, your body's not functioning necessarily at its best, then that's actually going to distract you from the task at hand. So one example is we taught athletes self-compassion, high-level college athletes, and they can't be second best. Their scholarships are riding on it. A lot of them want to go into the pros. So we taught them to be a good, supportive coach to themselves. Now, a good coach does not say to a top-level player, "Oh, there's no problem." If there is a problem, the good coach says, "No, you got to fix this. You got to improve that. That's not working." But does it from a place of care, not like you're crap. So you're worthless piece of, that's not very motivating. More motivating is, I'm going to give you honest feedback, but I'm going to help you figure out how to make those improvements that are so important to you. So when it comes from a place of care, it's received a lot better and it's more effective. And we found that their athletic performance did improve when they started practicing self-compassion.
Yeah, this messaging has to change, like that you have to be hard on yourself, like on your children, so that they can succeed and perform and achieve. It's so pervasive. And
yeah, it's really dangerous. I mean, yeah, you can have high standards or have high goals. If your love is contingent on it, then you're setting up that child for some good therapy sessions when they're older, right? Because if we feel our worth is contingent on our performance, then what happens? How are we going to learn and grow? Because the way we learn and grow is by making mistakes and failing. And so if every time we make a mistake and fail, we think we're worthless, then that's going to cause this negative spiral that's going to make it harder for us to learn and grow, right? But if we can separate our worth, whether it's our own worth in terms of our self-love, our worth is unconditional, or hopefully the love as parents we give to our kids is unconditional. It doesn't mean you don't want the best for your kids or have high standards for them or high expectations, whatever it is, but that's separate from your love for them. And when your kids really understand that your high standards are not in order, you don't want them to meet your standards in order for you to love them, but simply because you believe in them, you want the best for them, you care, you think they can do it, you want to see them happy and thrive, then that's going to be much more motivating, And the fact is, some people have strengths and weaknesses, and we don't want maybe our kid isn't going to be a top level athlete. Do we want to only love them if they are?
I think, I mean, of course, as parents, what you're saying would work perfectly fine if we as parents were not self-critical ourselves, right? That's why it begins with self-compassion. And I love that, right? It does.
Because if we're expecting our children to earn our sense of self-worth, my kids achieved a lot, therefore I must be worthy, that's a big burden on your kid.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love what you said a few minutes ago about regulating yourself so that you can reach your son. I think it's worth highlighting that.
And by the way, I have to say, it wasn't just when he was young and he was tantruming. When he learned how to drive when he was older, and this maybe all parents could relate to this. You know, when your kid's like learning how to make a left turn across a busy road and you're all stressed and nervous, and your kid gets stressed and nervous and it's harder for them to focus. But if you just like calm yourself and, you know, you're still vigilant, of course you are. But I would put my hand on my heart and calm myself. I'd be so nervous. And then once I calmed down, he would calm down and he would be a better driver. So it continues to this day, this thing of, you know, how we regulate ourselves. Because this is the way the human brain evolved. We have specialized neurons, a huge portion, real estate of the brain is devoted toward feeling the emotions of others, emotional resonance. So what we cultivate inside is directly felt by those around us. It's not just a hypothetical. It really happens. You know, if you see someone slam their finger on a door, the pain centers of your brain will get activated. That's the way the brain works. So by paying attention to what's going on in our own brain, then it also means that that's, you know, how that impacts other people around us.
Yeah, that's contagious. I mean, I'm sure we've all experienced that, right? When you go into a room and there was an argument before, you can cut that tension in the room. You can feel that. Or most parents, children misbehave, quote unquote, on the days when they are having a hard day, right? It's like, yeah, it's very interesting how stress and emotions are contagious. I think it's so important what you're saying, you know, emphasizing regulating ourselves so that our children will become regulated too. It will, number one, we will be calm and then we can calm their storm. But I think we hear, even in the, you know, in social media, in the parenting sphere, you always hear, you have to co-regulate with your children. You have to regulate your children's feelings. It's like the emphasis somehow like on that part that we have to do that. But if we're not regulated, we can't provide that, right? And what you said about, you know, that it's hard to try to be self-compassionate and practice that while your kid is having this meltdown. It's extremely hard, right? Can you say a few words about that? It's not like you're ignoring or neglecting them, because that itself can spiral you down, that I'm a bad mom. Why am I, you know, not attending to him? Or others may judge you. Maybe you're in a public space.
One of my favorite sayings in the self-compassion world is that the goal of practice is simply to be a compassionate mess. But that's not to say that our goal is to be a mess. The goal is when the mess of life arises, and in the context of parenting, it will without a doubt arise. Our goal is to simply bring compassion to that mess. So let's say your kid is tantruming, okay? So maybe you're feeling, and this is, you know, from life experience, you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed, or you don't know what to do, you're frustrated, or your boss is across the room and you feel like they may be judging you. All this stuff is going on. So ideally, you'd start by giving yourself compassion for that. And this is really hard right now. I'm not alone. This happens, you know, and that might be enough to kind of help you be regulated and have some equanimity so you can be with your child. Chances are that may work sometimes, and many times it won't work. And so you lose it and you snap at your kids like, shut up, or something like that, right? And then, oh, that's not my values. That's not what I want to be. I've hurt, you know. So all that arises. Well, instead of saying, oh, now I've blown it, you can instead reframe that as, what a great opportunity to practice self-compassion. I made a mistake. This is great. So my child learns that sometimes mommy loses it and snaps. Then you could say, you know, wow, I really lost it. You know, I'm so sorry. That's actually, I don't want to parent that way. Let's, you know, and then you kind of reframe. What can we learn from this? Oh, I see you is because I was stressed. If you actually, especially if you model it out loud. So kids learn non-verbally from our presence, their mirror neurons, you know, resonating with ours, but they also really learn verbally how we model it. So this is a great reframe. Every time you screw up as a parent, it's a brilliant opportunity to model for your kids how to practice self-compassion for being imperfect. And the thing that's really important is to not leave out, it's not just like, oh, well, I tried, that you always want to model, how can I learn and grow from this situation? Because obviously we don't want to snap at our kids, but we are going to because we're only human. So every time you do it, if you'd spend a little, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm very good at apologizing. It happens. You don't have to shame yourself for it. You don't want to apologize like, oh, I'm such a horrible person. It's like, I'm so sorry. But, human beings, I'm only human and I reached my limit. What happened? All I see is because of this stressor. How might we do this differently next time so it doesn't happen again? Because I don't want it to happen again because it's not my values. There's so many ways we can work with a situation as a learning situation. I just have to say, I've been watching This Is Us, and that film, that's kind of soap opera drama. One of the things that drives the kids crazy about the parent is she was too perfect. A perfect parent, you'll also drive your kids crazy if you're too perfect, because you need to be able to model how to deal with the imperfection of life. What do you do when you make mistakes? So there's a mess. A mess is fine as long as you're a compassionate mess. And actually more important than whether you're or not you're a mess is whether or not you're compassionate. That actually starts to become your goal, what you're aiming for. And, over and over again, no matter what happens, we can model and experience compassion for the messiness of life.
Yeah, otherwise you're going to create shame, induce shame for having committed mistakes. Like that's the last thing like you want to instill in your children. Or if you're a perfect parent, you're raising the bar for anxiety and fear of failure or attempting things. It's like, wow, there's no room for being human.
Yeah. And if you as a parent model that your worth as a parent comes only from getting things right, then what message are you giving to your kid? Again, the mistakes, the mess, obviously we don't try to make mistakes, but that is life. And we can embrace that, especially with this goal of always trying to learn, because of course we want to grow and we don't want to do things that are against our values. We want to reach our full potential. But if you model that as this is a process, it's not I'm perfect or I'm not perfect. We make mistakes, we get back up again, we learn, we grow, it's a process, iterative process. What a great message to give to your kids. What a permission structure you give to them also to make mistakes, to learn from them, to grow from them.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And then when they grow up, they won't have to struggle with self-worth and deriving it from the wrong sources, like many of us do.
Looking for love in all the wrong places. I love that song. It's so true, though, isn't it? If we look for our love, our sense of worth from other people's approval, for instance, that can lead to all sorts of problems. We don't draw appropriate boundaries, for instance. We may be in toxic relationships or work situations. We need to know our own worth in order to make good decisions for ourselves in life.
Yeah. Could you speak about then the difference between self-worth and self-esteem, since we're talking about this right now?
Yeah. So, so self-worth is just, quite literally being the sense of having worth, value as a person. And so self-compassion and self-esteem are both forms of self-worth. So the self-worth of self-compassion comes from being a flawed human being like everyone else. It's unconditional because you're always, it's not like sometimes you aren't a flawed human being. You are also a flawed human being. So it's a very stable sense of self-worth. You don't have to go to graduate school to earn the self-worth of self-compassion. The moment you're born as a flawed human being, you're part of the club, and research shows it is a very stable sense of self-worth over time. And it's especially there for you when you fail or make mistakes or are struggling. Self-esteem is an estimation of worth. It's contingent. It's contingent on being liked or looking a certain way or achieving your goals. So it's a judgment or an evaluation of worth. And unfortunately, when you need it most, like when you fail or make a mistake, often our self-esteem deserts us. It's a fair weather friend, right? We judge ourselves poorly and then we lose our sense of self-worth. So you might say self-compassion is a true and stable friend. Self-esteem is a fair weather friend. Nothing wrong with self-esteem, but we don't want to invest too heavily in, our worth coming from what other people think of us or achieving our goals. It's kind of a treadmill we'll never get off of. Also being special and above average. That's another big source of self-esteem. It's not okay to be average. Well, if it's not okay to be average, First of all, not everyone can be above average at the same time. And it sets up like competition and set up narcissism or prejudice. A lot of nasty social behaviors stem from the need to feel special and above average.
Wow, that's good. Who is the self in self-compassion? I heard you speak about this somewhere. I'm like, love this.
Well, yeah. So if it's a little confusing. I know, like Dan Siegel said, Kristin, you shouldn't call it self-compassion. You should call it inner compassion. But the word self it's useful because usually when we have a sense of separate self, feels limited, feels like insecure, incapable, that's the self that's hurting. Right? That sense of a limited, flawed self or incapable, it's cut off from others. It's in pain. So you might say the self in self-compassion, the separate self is the one that needs the compassion, but the person giving the compassion is not so separate. Think about it when your friend comes to you and they're upset about something. You just really feel compassion to your friend. There's not a lot of sense of separate self for you. You kind of feel expanded. You feel bigger. You feel more capable. You feel like you're in the flow. You feel like maybe in your higher self, your best self. That is, you might say, the self, or not much of a self there, is actually giving the compassion. So one of the things if you look at self-compassion, one of the things that's happening is we shift from kind of the contents of our thoughts and emotions. I'm not good enough, or I failed, or this hurts, or whatever, this is bad. We shift from being identified with these negative thoughts and emotions to coming from the stance of the compassionate presence that feels moved and wants to help in this situation. So it's like your sense of self actually shifts. It goes from being small and limited to being much more interconnected, much more capable, much bigger. And that's partly how it works, is we're loosening the sense of self.
Yeah, it actually makes us less self-centered.
Yes. And there's research that shows that actually, that shows that we're less self-focused, for instance, when we practice self-compassion.
Yeah, because when you self-pity yourself, I was stuck in self-pity mode yesterday. And then I snapped out of it, right? I was able to extend self-compassion because I was in a doctor's office. And then I saw that it's not only me who has this problem, like I'm in this doctor's office, all these other people are suffering with this too. In the beginning, I was indulging in self-pity because I think there is a little place for that, but it has its expiration. You have to move into self-compassion.
You can honor that part of you that needs some care. It's a part of you saying, oh, I'm hurting. You can definitely honor that part of you that needs care and love and attention. You don't necessarily need to say that it's, you're the only one in the world. It's just that part of ourselves is crying out for some tenderness and holding. And so you can respond to that part. It's not a bad thing at all.
I like that you're bringing, again, the self-compassion lens approach to this because, yeah, and Dick Schwartz's model, right? It seems like it's very connected with what you're teaching.
Yeah. So Dick Schwartz's model, he developed IFS and, heart psychology, which has actually been around forever. But the truth is, not only are we not really a separate self, we aren't even one self. We've got different parts of ourselves. Sometimes they can feel conflicting things at the same time. So any part of ourself, any kind of cluster of thoughts, emotions, behavior that arises is worthy of compassion. And so we need, again, to honor the pain of that. But we don't want to be what in IFS is called blended with it. I call it over-identified. We don't want to be lost in those thoughts, feelings, behaviors, because often there's not a lot of truth to them, or it's exaggerated, or it feels more limited and separate than it really is. So we can honor the pain, we can show up for ourselves, but remember, not only we aren't just those hurt parts, we're also the compassionate presence that's able to open our hearts to those hurt parts. And then what happens is you start identifying with that. That starts to be your home base, someone who's compassionate, who feels connected to the larger whole, who's warm, who's caring, who's mindful, who's got some equilibrium. That's a really nice place to live. And to be a parent.
Yes.
And to parent from both. Yeah.
Why is it called mindful self-compassion? What is that mindful part? I'm always confused. I feel like it's a dumb question, but I want to ask anyways.
Well, it's kind of a funny question. And the answer, I don't know if it's going to be satisfying or not, but, I developed my model of self-compassion, the 3 parts, mindfulness, kindness, and a common humanity. And I met Chris Germer, who helped me. We co-created the program. And I thought it should just be called the self-compassion program. And he said, well, Kristin, people don't know really what self-compassion is. There's all this work on mindfulness. And the program is also going to teach some basic mindfulness skills. And yes, it's kind of redundant, but let's call it mindful self-compassion just to emphasize mindfulness is a part of this. So it is a little bit redundant. It's not necessary, but I think it was effective in the sense that I think more people were willing, at least back then, to join a mindful self-compassion program than just a self-compassion program. It also kind of highlighted that both of us were coming from more of a contemplative tradition. Things like understanding who am I separate as I think I am, and things like meditation, which is not the only way to learn self-compassion, but it can be very helpful. So I think that was also an emphasis put on there. But yeah, technically, it's redundant.
Okay, well, thank you for answering that because I was confused. Behavioral self-compassion. Can you talk about that a little bit? What is it and how?
Yeah, so behavioral self-compassion is often referred to as self-care. That's kind of the behaviors we can do, usually actions that meet our needs, like taking naps, eating well, rest, getting the sleep we need, hanging out with friends, eating well, things like that, getting massages, doing yoga. So behavioral self-care is really important, especially like if you're a caregiver and you're spending so much of your time and energy and resources on other people. When you practice behavioral self-care, it's a way of saying, hey, my needs count too. I need to spend some of my precious time and energy and resources on myself, caring for myself. So you might say it's a subset of self-compassion. It's a little different in that, so if you just talk about self-care, you don't necessarily need suffering to be present. Again, by definition, self-compassion, the Latin, means how do we show up for ourselves when suffering is arising? Now, you might do yoga and there's no suffering. So it's preventative. So it's related to it, but it's not exactly the same thing. And it doesn't necessarily refer to dealing with an instance, for instance, of emotional or psychological pain.
I see.
But it's all good, right? It's all part of the big happy mishmash pie of goodwill toward yourself.
It is treating yourself with kindness and care that you deserve. Maybe you're right. Maybe suffering is not present in that very moment when you do yoga, but it's sort of preventative. It's still care towards the same thing.
Exactly, right. So it's just kind of broader.
Yeah.
So in one way it's a subset and another way it's broader. It kind of, it kind of depends how you look at it. It all falls under the umbrella of kindness and warmth and goodwill. I think goodwill is the best phrase for it because it really, this desire to help. Fortunately, when suffering is present, and especially when that suffering comes from making a mistake or failing in some way, our goodwill goes out the window, lickety split. So that's why it's so important to really be mindful. Oh, wow. Okay. This is hard. This is hurting. I'm suffering. I'm struggling. I'm feeling tense. And then bring in the other components.
Because your stress response gets activated. That's why, right? You go into fight, flight,
or freeze. And so the last thing you want to do when you're in fight, flight, or freeze is to go into the care response. So we're having to do a little hack, so for instance, when you put your hand on your heart, you're activating your care response. You're lowering your cortisol levels. There's research showing that. You're kind of saying, okay, I know I'm activated, but I'm going to be here for myself in a kind and supportive way. And then we calm down physiologically and then also mentally as well.
Because you don't want to be the source of your own threat. Right?
Well, you're making things a million times worse.
Yeah.
I mean, some threat is good. We want to pay attention. There's a problem we need to pay attention to. But how am I best going to meet that challenge? By calling myself names or saying, there's a problem. What's the best way to deal with this? It's going to be most effective or, generate learning and growth. Calling yourself names is usually not very good for anything other than kind of depressing yourself and lowering your energy, making you feel cut off from others.
When you say suffering, could you say a little more about that, what that entails?
Yeah. So in some ways, it's an unfortunate word. I use it because just technically that's what passion in the Latin means. And compassion is concern with the alleviation of suffering by definition. But it can be, sometimes that's big suffering. major life events or really big problems. Sometimes it's just minor irritation. It's any sort of negative thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are uncomfortable that cause any sort of stress or distress, big or small. Same principles apply. It's a little harder when the stress is a big one. Actually, not always. Sometimes we remember to be compassionate when we're really struggling, but we forget when we just stub our toe, we're a little irritated. The same principles apply to hold any sort of emotional or mental discomfort with encouragement, kindness, care, support, and connectedness and mindfulness.
Yeah, and I think I remember from our first interview, if I remember this correctly, that we practice self-compassion in the present moment. It's not like mindfulness meditation that we just practice to get better and gain benefits for the future. Am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, I mean, you can do, well, first of all, just practicing mindfulness meditation, we know increases the tendency to be self compassionate in those difficult moments. And you actually can do practices like meditations that are designed to cultivate goodwill toward yourself, which is more means when those difficult moments, you're more likely to remain in that sense, place of goodwill. Or you can even intentionally call up something you're struggling with in your real life and practice that way. But yeah, so self compassion, again, remember, how am I with suffering? How do I show up for myself? Do I have my own back? Am I feeling connected? Am I calm? Or at least am I aware of what's happening in my lack of calm? Am I warm? Am I supportive? It's a skill to be used in the moment for sure. And it keeps us from being knocked down by those difficult moments the way we often are.
And what do you do these days? Have you developed new practices or you still do the same? You put your hand on your heart and talk to yourself, rocking. What do you do these days?
Yeah, well, so I mean, in terms of like what I've developed, so I've got something called the self compassion community. And one of the things I developed is a what do I need toolkit where you can actually check in with just what do I need right now? And they have a lot of little practices designed. Maybe you need to de-stress, maybe you need to relax, maybe you need to encourage yourself, maybe you need to protect yourself, maybe you need to provide for yourself. So that's one of the things I've developed to make it very much in response to this particular question, what do I need? Right. So that's what I've developed for others, but that's also something I'm doing for myself more. I'll actually check in with myself and say, what do I really need right now? Even asking the question is self-compassionate because you're valuing your needs. You aren't devaluing yourself. You're saying, my needs are important. What do I need right now to be well, to be healthy, to be there for myself, to show up for myself? So that's something that I do. I think more and more in my own practice, I am using this gateway of investigating, what self am I caught up in right now? Am I feeling separate? Am I feeling limited? Am I feeling small? Or am I coming from this place of this larger sense of loving, connected presence? It's actually another way of describing the three components of kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness is loving, connected presence. So I'll notice that I'm caught in what's happening and I'll move into the loving, connected presence. It's being aware of what's happening. And that shift is a way that I'm using more and more to practice self-compassion.
That first, what do I need? And you mentioned a few things. It sounds like a nice map. Is that available anywhere on your website or in your books?
So the toolkit is only for community members, which is really cheap. The thing of what do I need? Yeah, I think in the burnout book, we have a chapter on asking yourself what we need. I think maybe and also in the mindful self-compassion workbook, we say it's a quintessential self-compassion question. What do I need right now? And it's a nice way in just pausing and asking yourself. Usually, it's the last thing we think about. We're just thinking about what other people need or what do we need to do instead of saying, actually, what do I need? What do I need right now that would help me cope or that would help? Sometimes we need soothing and comforting and validating. Sometimes we need to take action. Sometimes we need to say no or draw a boundary. That the answer can be very, very different depending on the situation.
Well, thank you so much. This is so rich. I really love this work. Like I said, it transformed how I relate and treat myself for sure. And I'm really grateful for your work. And I can't wait to see what's next.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm excited too. I'm excited about the book. I'm excited about my new community. I'm just, Really, I'm so fortunate to have this calling. It's really wanting to help people be more self-compassionate. So I think I'll be doing this till the day I drop.
Why don't you tell us then about the community if somebody is interested in joining? Like plug
Yeah. Well,
everything that you have.
yeah. Well, if you just go to selfcompassion.org or even Google self-compassion, you'll find me. I started it because I realized that some people maybe like to read books or take workshops, but other people have a different doorway in. So it's a very small monthly fee. We also have scholarships, but we have mentor sessions where you can actually go to a session, ask questions, get some guidance. I've got this What Do I Need toolkit. I've got great guest events. So for instance, I've got Tara Brock, who's on next month, and then I'm going to have Dick Schwartz and Dan Harris just agreed, Shauna Shapiro. So I have people talk to members of my community. They can ask them questions. I have gatherings with me once a month. You can ask me questions if you want. So there's a lot more interactive ways, including live events, to learn about self-compassion. So for some people's learning styles, it's a really nice way in.
Oh, that's excellent. I would like to be part of this.
Well, sure.
Join. Sounds great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your presence and your sharing and your work.
Oh, thanks, Anna. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Self-compassion is your superpower. Self-compassion is the most essential tool that any parent can learn to cultivate. And with self-compassion, you can definitely thrive on your parenting journey. I would love to hear what resonated with you in this episode. What are your biggest takeaways and aha moments? So get in touch. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a note by email. Call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And of course, I have a tool for international listeners. It's free. It's called SpeakPipe. You will find it there as well. You can send me a voice note. It's pretty cool. Be sure to hit that follow button so you don't miss future episodes. Take a moment to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps others discover our community. And of course, if you enjoy the show and love the content, be sure to show your support by making a donation. Go to authenticparenting.com/support and make a donation. Suggested amounts are $5, $10, and more. Authentic Parenting is a free resource and it's solely listener supported. Your contributions make a big difference. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your generosity. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.